February 2007, Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. A man in his mid-40s sits perfectly still as 12 jurors file back into the room. He does not fidget. He does not look at them. His arms are crossed, and if you did not know what was happening, you might think he was waiting for a delayed flight, not a decision about whether the United States government would put a needle in his arm. The jury cannot agree on death. The vote splits 9-3, life without parole, automatic. Kenneth McGriff, known to everyone who matters as Supreme, swivels slowly in his chair. He waves to 3 rows of friends and family. He taps his chest gently above the heart. Then he hugs one of his lawyers, nods politely at the prosecutors who had just spent weeks arguing he deserved execution, and lets the marshals walk him out. The U.S. attorney steps to a microphone and calls him one of the most dangerous and feared narcotics traffickers in New York. Says he devoted the better part of 2 decades to gangs, drugs, and violence. Treated every prison sentence as a minor interruption. And that last part, the interruption, is the detail that makes this story different from 100 other drug kingpin stories you have already heard. Because Kenneth McGriff did not just survive prison, he came back bigger. He came back connected to platinum-selling rappers, Hollywood producers, and a record label that was printing money faster than his old crack operation ever did. And every single one of those connections ended in blood, indictments, or both. The question that no prosecutor ever fully answered, and that the streets of Queens still argue about, is whether Supreme was trying to claw his way into a legitimate life and kept getting pulled back, or whether the legitimate world was always just a better mask for the same game. To understand that, you have to go back to a place where $200,000 changed hands every single day, and nobody in charge had finished high school. South Jamaica, Queens, early 1980s, the Baisley Park houses. If you grew up in New York during this era, you know the name the way you know the names of weather systems. It was a force. It moved through the neighborhood and rearranged everything it touched. Kenneth McGriff was born on September 19, 1959. He grew up around dealers the way other kids grew up around plumbers and bus drivers. It was the local industry. Southeast Queens in the 70s was not yet the war zone it would become, but the signposts were already there. Older guys on the block moved product. Younger guys watched and learned. McGriff was one of the watchers. By his late teens, he was doing small jobs, guarding stash houses, counting cash, proving he could be trusted with things that would land other people in prison. He was not known as a fighter. People who knew him from that era say he was connected to a group called the Peace Gods, and that connection gave him a certain weight. But his real currency was not violence. It was thinking. And that distinction mattered because the mid-80s crack boom did not reward the loudest or the toughest. It rewarded the most organized. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what crack did to a neighborhood like South Jamaica. Before crack, the drug economy in the projects was relatively contained. Heroin was the main product, the customer base was limited, and the money was decent but not transformative. Crack changed the math entirely. It was cheap to produce, wildly addictive, and it created a customer base that came back not weekly, but daily, sometimes hourly. A block that had generated a few $1,000s a week in heroin sales could suddenly generate tens of thousands a day in crack sales. The economics were staggering. And the competition for those economics was lethal. In 1981, McGriff and a handful of friends, most of them teenagers, most of them members of a quasi-religious sect called the 5%ers, an offshoot of the Nation of Islam that taught its followers they were the enlightened 5% of humanity, formed a crew. He named it after himself, the Supreme Team. And from the very beginning, it operated differently than the other crews tearing through Queens. McGriff built a hierarchy. He had lieutenants, enforcers, lookouts, distributors, and a discipline system. He recruited Latino members, unusual for the time, because they had cocaine connections that most black street crews did not. He treated the crack trade not as a hustle, but as a supply chain. And while other dealers were spending their money on chains and cars and advertising their success to every cop with a pair of binoculars, McGriff kept his operation tight, structured, quiet enough to grow. By the middle of the decade, quiet was no longer possible. The Supreme Team's network had swelled to over 100 members. They controlled the crack trade across the Baisley Park houses and the surrounding blocks. And at its peak in 1987, the crew's daily revenue, the amount that moved through that one housing project, exceeded $200,000 every day. To put that in perspective, some mid-sized American companies did not generate that kind of daily cash flow. But the Supreme Team was doing it out of stairwells and project hallways, with no formal accounting, no business license, and no legal recourse if someone stole from them. Which meant the only recourse was violence, and there was plenty of it. Members wore matching red jackets with the word Supreme stitched across the back. They drove expensive cars through the neighborhood slowly, windows down, automatic weapons visible. It was branding, it was theater, and it worked. The neighborhood feared them, respected them, or both, and there was not always a clean line between those two reactions. But here is the thing about building an empire in plain sight. Every person who feared the Supreme Team was also a potential witness. Every red jacket was a target. And every day that $200,000 moved through the projects was another day the federal government circled closer. In 1987, a joint state and federal investigation hit the crew. McGriff was arrested. And here is where the first strange turn happens, the turn that would define the rest of his life. He did not fight the charges. He pled guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise. Took 12 years. And while most people expected the Supreme Team to collapse the moment the boss went away, what actually happened was worse. Much worse. Because the man who took over was not a businessman. He was McGriff's nephew, Gerald Miller. And Gerald Miller's street name, Prince, was not a title. It was a warning. Where Supreme had been calculating, Prince was volatile. Where Supreme used violence strategically, a tool deployed when negotiation failed, Prince used it recreationally. He expanded the security force, hired more enforcers, and turned the paranoia dial to a level that made even loyal members afraid to make eye contact on a bad day. In 1987 alone, the same year McGriff went to prison, Prince and the incarcerated Supreme ordered at least 8 murders. 8 in 1 year, from inside and outside a federal prison. And the corruption ran deeper than street soldiers. Prince had 2 New York State Parole Division employees on the payroll. One was a parole officer named Ina McGriff, no relation to Kenneth, who was supposed to be supervising the parole of a Supreme Team enforcer named Ernesto Pinella. Instead, she had become romantically involved with him. She falsified compliance reports. She and a secretary named Ronnie Younger, who was romantically involved with Prince himself, fed the crew information from law enforcement databases, home addresses of rivals, parole schedules of enemies, the details that let killers show up at the right place at the right time. Prince killed rivals. He killed people suspected of being disloyal. He killed the crew's own drug suppliers. 2 Colombian men who brought 5 kilos of cocaine to the projects were murdered by team members. Their heads were wrapped in plastic bags while they were still alive. As they suffocated, a crew member beat their skulls with a baseball bat. A 4th man was called in to help dispose of the bodies. They were loaded into a car and dumped in separate locations across Queens. And the staggering part was not the brutality, it was the strategic blindness. Those Colombians were a steady pipeline. With them, the Supreme Team had a reliable supply of cocaine that could be processed into crack and sold at an enormous markup. Without them, the crew had to scramble for a new connection. They found one. Then, they killed that supplier too. The total take from that murder was 2 kilos of cocaine. 2 kilos in exchange for a severed supply chain and another pair of bodies to explain. This was the era of South Jamaica that outsiders remember as a war zone, and from the inside, it was even worse. The neighborhood was simultaneously the territory of the Supreme Team, the nearby crew run by Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols, and smaller operations grinding their own corners. And it was this cluster of violence, this density of bodies and product and weapons in one patch of Queens that produced a murder in 1988 so explosive it changed the entire political landscape of American policing. On February 26, 1988, a 22-year-old rookie NYPD officer named Edward Byrne sat in his patrol car at the corner of Inwood Street and 107th Avenue in South Jamaica. He was guarding the home of a witness who had been calling police about drug dealing on his street. The witness's house had already been firebombed twice. Byrne was assigned to sit outside it, alone. Around 3:30 in the morning, a car pulled up. One man knocked on the passenger window. Another came around the driver's side and fired 5 rounds into the car. Byrne never had a chance. He was 22 years old. He had been on the force for 7 months. The murder was ordered by Howard "Pappy" Mason, a drug boss tied to Fat Cat Nichols, not directly to the Supreme Team. But the killing happened in their neighborhood, in their ecosystem, in the crack economy they had all built together. And the shockwave was nuclear. President Reagan called the Byrne family personally. Vice President George H.W. Bush picked up Byrne's badge and carried it with him for the rest of his presidential campaign. Congress fast-tracked the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. The NYPD created the Tactical Narcotics Team and flooded South Jamaica with hundreds of officers. Within days, 82 people were arrested on narcotics charges. Within months, the sweeps expanded. Fat Cat's network was dismantled. The Supreme Team, already fractured by Prince's erratic violence, was shattered. By 1993, Prince Miller and 6 other Supreme Team members were convicted of racketeering and narcotics trafficking. Miller got decades. The crew was finished. And Kenneth McGriff, sitting in a federal cell, watched all of it from behind a wall. He served roughly 7 years of his 12-year sentence and was paroled in early 1994. Within months, he was back in prison on parole violations. He served another 2.5 years, and in 1997, he walked out again. Now, here is where you need to pay attention, because what happens next is not the story of a man who learned his lesson. And it is not the story of a man who went straight. It is something stranger and harder to categorize. Kenneth McGriff came back to Southeast Queens and tried to build something new, but he built it on the same foundation, with the same people, and with the same gravitational pull that had defined his entire adult life. He assembled a new crew. Not the supreme team, most of them were locked up or dead. A new enterprise. And this time, instead of street-level crack in the projects, he went wholesale. Heroin and cocaine, moving through a corridor that stretched from New York down through Maryland and into North Carolina. The scale was larger, the footprint was wider, and the money was more serious. But McGriff did something else after his release that changed the trajectory of the story entirely. He walked into the world of hip-hop, not as a fan, not as a hanger-on, as a player. Because by 1997, the streets of Queens had produced something besides drug crews. They had produced rappers, producers, record labels, an entire industry rooted in the same blocks, the same codes, and the same stories that McGriff had lived. And the man standing at the intersection of that street world and that music world was an old neighborhood friend named Irving Lorenzo. You know him as Irv Gotti. If this is the kind of story you stay for, where the obvious headline hides a deeper and more uncomfortable truth, subscribe to the channel. Because what happened between McGriff and hip-hop did not just ruin careers, it ended lives. And the first domino had not even fallen yet. Irv Gotti grew up in Hollis, Queens, same borough, same era, same proximity to the crack economy, but a different lane. Gotti was a DJ, then a producer, then a talent scout. He helped discover Jay-Z. He executive produced the debut album of DMX, which went straight to #1. He signed Ja Rule. He launched Ashanti. And in 1998, he and his brother Chris co-founded a record label under the Def Jam umbrella. They called it Murder Inc. The name alone tells you something about the culture. In '98, calling your label Murder Inc. was not controversial. It was branding. It said, "We come from the streets, we kept the edge, and the music is real." Jay-Z had already nicknamed Gotti after John Gotti, the mob boss, and the label leaned into that mythology hard. The first release was Ja Rule's debut, Veni Vedi Veci. It went platinum. Then came Pain is Love, which went triple platinum. Ashanti's self-titled debut went multi-platinum and won a Grammy. Gotti produced hits for Jennifer Lopez that went to #1. He paired Ja Rule with J-Lo, with Ashanti, with everyone. And the formula worked so well that in its first 5 years, Murder Inc. earned $50 million in profit from 14 million CDs sold. The annual gross exceeded $100 million. For a small imprint under Def Jam, these were staggering numbers. Billboard later named 2 of the label's tracks among the top Hot 100 songs of the 21st century. And somewhere behind all of that platinum and all of those Billboard charts, behind the Grammy Awards, the MTV appearances, the Universal Music corporate meetings, Kenneth McGriff was circling. Not in the background, not accidentally. He was there because he and Irv Gotti had grown up on the same streets, because their histories were woven together before either of them had money or power. And because in Queens, the line between the music world and the street world was not a line at all. It was the same sidewalk. The defense lawyers would later say that McGriff's connection to Irv Gotti was part of a genuine effort to go legitimate, that he wanted to make movies, that he wanted to produce music, and there is evidence for that. In 1998, McGriff flew to Hollywood and tried to purchase the film rights to a novel by Donald Goines, a street-lit author whose books were Bibles in the projects. The book was called Black Gangster. He came back multiple times over the next 5 years to negotiate. He eventually helped produce one film, Crime Partners. It was a straight-to-video release starring Ja Rule, Snoop Dogg, and Ice-T. It was not a hit. But it existed. It was a real movie, and McGriff's name was on it. So, was he going legit? Was this a man trying to climb out of the life? Maybe. But the federal government saw something different. They saw a convicted drug lord laundering money through a record label. They saw over $1 million in what they believed were drug proceeds flowing into Murder, Inc. They saw McGriff's drug operation running simultaneously, heroin and cocaine moving down the East Coast while Ja Rule videos played on MTV. And then came the song that lit the fuse. In early 2000, a young rapper from South Jamaica named Curtis Jackson, street name 50 Cent, recorded a track called Ghetto Quran for an album that was supposed to launch his career. The album was called Power of the Dollar, and Columbia Records was behind it. Jackson was not yet famous. He was not yet the bulletproof brand. He was a 24-year-old kid from the neighborhood, doing what kids from the neighborhood had always done, telling the story of the streets he grew up on. Except this time, the story had names attached. The song referenced McGriff directly. It described the Supreme Team. It characterized Supreme as the respected businessman and Prince as the killer. It named the crew, the hierarchy, and the atmosphere of the era in a way that sounded like an oral history set to a Diana Ross sample. A writer for Vibe magazine later called it among the most controversial records ever laid on wax. Columbia Records never released the album, but the track leaked. By mid-2000, Ghetto Quran was circulating on mixtapes and burned CDs across Queens, Brooklyn, and Harlem. The streets had the song before the label had decided what to do with it. And in a world where certain names were spoken only in whispers, Curtis Jackson had put them in a chorus. What happened next depends on who you ask. Federal investigators later stated in a sealed affidavit that they believed the shooting of Curtis Jackson in May of 2000, the infamous incident where 50 Cent was hit 9 times outside his grandmother's house in South Jamaica, was retaliation for Ghetto Quran. The IRS criminal investigator who wrote the affidavit said law enforcement believed McGriff orchestrated the hit. Others, including people close to both sides, say the shooting was about something different, that it was not the song itself that angered McGriff, but 50's ongoing conflict with Ja Rule and Murder, Inc., at a time when McGriff was trying to use the label as his legitimate bridge. That 50 was threatening the one clean thing McGriff had. Either way, the aftermath was devastating. 50 Cent survived 9 bullets. Columbia Records dropped him. And then something happened that has never been fully explained in a courtroom. An unspoken blacklist descended on Curtis Jackson. Producers would not return his calls. Labels would not sign him. Studios in Queens, the same studios where he had been a regular, would not book sessions. Columbia Records dropped him entirely, shelving the album that Ghetto Quran was supposed to anchor. The message moved through the industry the way information always moved in that world, not through memos or press releases, but through a network of nods, phone calls, and silences. Supreme does not want this kid to have a career, and if you help him, you are choosing a side. Most people chose the safer side. 50 Cent was radioactive. He had survived 9 bullets, but could not get a beat from a producer who lived 3 blocks away. And then one man defied that blacklist. Jason Mizell, Jam Master Jay, the DJ and turntablist of Run DMC, the group that had brought hip-hop to mainstream America, the first rap group with a gold album, the first on MTV, the group that stood on stage with Aerosmith and rewrote the rules of what popular music could be. Jay was from Hollis, Queens. He had known 50 since the kid was coming up. And when the rest of the industry backed away, Jay stepped forward. He mentored him, introduced him to contacts, worked with him in the studio, put his own reputation on the line for a rapper that everyone else had been told to avoid. On October 30th, 2002, Jam Master Jay was shot and killed inside his recording studio in Merrick Boulevard, Queens. He was 37 years old. Federal investigators began looking into whether the murder was connected to the McGriff-50 Cent rivalry, whether Jay had been killed for defying the blacklist. The IRS investigator wrote in the same affidavit that agents were trying to determine if Mizell's murder had any connection to the ongoing dispute. The case remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades. In 2020, 2 men, Carl Jordan Jr., Jay's own godson, and Ronald Washington, a childhood friend, were arrested and charged. In February 2024, both were convicted. Prosecutors said the murder was about a cocaine deal gone wrong. Jay had been moonlighting as a cocaine middleman after Run DMC's commercial peak, and the killers were cut out of a deal. But even in the trial, McGriff's shadow was present. The cocaine world that Jay had drifted into was the same cocaine world that McGriff had built. The neighborhood codes, the debts, the loyalty tests, they all traced back to the same ecosystem. Jay had not been killed by Supreme, but he died in the world Supreme helped create. And while Jay's murder sent shockwaves through hip-hop, the federal government was already closing in on the man at the center of the web. The year before Jay's death, 2001, McGriff had ordered 2 killings that would ultimately end his freedom forever. The first target was Eric Smith, a rapper who went by E-Moneybags. Smith had fatally shot a McGriff associate named Colbert Johnson, known as Black Just, in 1999. McGriff wanted revenge. He hired a team of hitmen from Harlem and paid them $50,000. On July 16, 2001, Smith was gunned down in Queens. After the shooting, McGriff sent a text message to a friend. 4 words: "You missed the party." The second target was Troy Singleton, known as Big Nose. McGriff believed Singleton might retaliate on Smith's behalf, so Singleton was killed too. Preemptive, clinical. The logic of a man who had been managing violence as a business operation for 20 years. Meanwhile, the investigation into Murder, Inc. was accelerating. In January 2003, the FBI and police raided the label's Manhattan offices. Agents seized computers and financial documents. The raid was part of a year-long investigation into whether Irv Gotti and his brother Chris had laundered over $1 million in McGriff's drug money to launch the label. Here is the question that still divides people who followed this story closely. Was Kenneth McGriff genuinely trying to use Murder, Inc. as his exit ramp from the drug world? A man who saw hip-hop as his second chance and kept getting pulled back by old debts and old enemies? Or was the music always a front? A sophisticated way to wash drug money through platinum records and straight-to-video films while running wholesale heroin down the East Coast. If you have your own reading of the evidence, leave it below. For a growing channel, a real argument is worth more than 100 generic comments. Because the trial that followed did not settle the question, it only made it louder. In 2005, the Lorenzo brothers went to trial on money laundering charges. The jury acquitted them on every count. Irv Gotti walked out of the courthouse a free man. He later said the investigation destroyed his reputation in corporate America, that everyone who had believed in him distanced themselves the moment the FBI showed up. Murder, Inc. changed its name to The Inc. The Platinum era was over. The damage was permanent, even without a conviction. McGriff did not get the same outcome. His trial began in January 2007 in federal court in Brooklyn. The government laid out its case methodically. Between 1997 and 2002, McGriff had rebuilt a sprawling criminal organization from the wreckage of the Supreme Team. He had promoted it from retail to wholesale. His network had distributed over 30 kilograms of heroin, 150 kilograms of cocaine, and 1.5 kilograms of crack cocaine. The drugs had moved through New York, down into Maryland and North Carolina, through a corridor that prosecutors described as a franchise operation, with McGriff at the top. They proved the murders, the hitmen from Harlem, the $50,000, the text message, "You missed the party," sent while Eric Smith's body was still warm. By the time nearly all of his assets had been seized, McGriff could not even afford a private attorney. The man who had once run an operation pulling in $200,000 a day was defended by a court-appointed lawyer. That detail, the distance between the red jackets and the court appointment, tells its own story. On February 1st, the jury convicted him of murder for hire, drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. The deliberation took 5 days. Then came the penalty phase, the question of whether Kenneth McGriff would die by lethal injection or spend the rest of his natural life in a cell. It was the first time a federal jury in New York City had been asked to consider the death penalty since 1954. The jury could not agree. 9 voted for life. 3 voted for death. The split meant automatic life without parole. McGriff's defense attorney, David Runke, said afterward, "The client feels relieved, and we feel relieved to have gotten to death's door and not have it open." After the verdict, Smith's mother and Singleton's aunt embraced the prosecutors. And then something happened that no one in the courtroom expected. McGriff's 61-year-old brother David walked over to both women, shook their hands, and said 3 words, "I am sorry." And so, on February 9, 2007, Kenneth Supreme McGriff heard his formal sentence and did what he had done his entire life. He absorbed the blow without flinching. He waved to his family. He tapped his chest gently above the heart. He nodded at the prosecutors. He let the marshals walk him out of the courtroom and into a transport vehicle headed for ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, the prison they call the Alcatraz of the Rockies, where he would begin what the government intended to be the rest of his existence. If you stay for stories where the real answer does not fit on a bumper sticker, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this man's shadow did not stop moving when the cell door closed. The prosecutor at sentencing said McGriff treated his prior sentences as mere interruptions in his pursuit of a life of crime. And that phrase, mere interruptions, might be the most honest thing anyone in a suit ever said about him. Because every time the system removed Kenneth McGriff from the streets reorganized around his absence and waited for him to come back. And every time he came back, the scale was larger, the connections were deeper, and the consequences were more destructive. He started with street-level crack in a housing project. He came back to wholesale heroin moving across state lines. He started with red jackets and project stairwells. He came back to Hollywood film rights, platinum record labels, and a text message celebrating a murder. And the people who paid the highest price were not the ones who built the empire. They were the ones who brushed against it. Eric Smith was a 26-year-old rapper who never had a hit record. He died because he shot the wrong person's friend. Troy Singleton died because McGriff thought he might become a problem. Jam Master Jay, a man who defined an entire genre of music, who stood on stages with Aerosmith and brought hip-hop to MTV, died in the same Queens ecosystem that McGriff's Supreme team had wired for violence 2 decades earlier. And Curtis Jackson survived 9 bullets and turned his near death into the greatest marketing campaign in rap history. But he lived the rest of his career looking over his shoulder at a man who was already in prison. And the Jam Master Jay case, the case that had haunted hip-hop for 2 decades, took its own strange turn. Jordan's conviction was overturned by the same judge who had presided over the trial. She ruled the government had failed to prove his motive. Washington's conviction stood. A third suspect awaits trial. The case that was supposed to bring closure instead opened new fractures. And the question of whether Jay's death was connected to the McGriff 50 Cent rivalry, the theory the FBI had pursued for years, was never answered in court. The official story is a drug deal gone wrong. The street story is longer and uglier. The truth, as it usually does in cases that touch this many powerful people, sits somewhere in between, unclaimed. The Supreme Team documentary that Nas directed in 2022, Nas, himself a Queens legend, himself a man who grew up in the same gravitational field, tried to frame all of this as a story about America's relationship with Black power. And there is something to that. The Italian Mafia produced the Godfather trilogy, The Sopranos, and a permanent place in American mythology. Frank Sinatra's mob connections added mystique to his career long before street credibility became a hip-hop prerequisite. But America has never been able to see a black figure with street power the same way. If John Gotti was a crime boss, the Supreme Team were thugs. If the Gambinos were a family, the Supreme Team were gang members destroying their own community. The framing was never equal. The consequences were never equal either. Irv Gotti, the man who stood at the intersection of Supreme's street world and hip-hop's corporate world, died in February 2025 at the age of 54. He had been acquitted. He had survived the investigation. But the years after the raid, the rebranding, the loss of corporate trust, the slow fade from the industry he had helped build, those years took something that no jury verdict could return. And McGriff, Supreme, the man who named a gang after himself and watched it consume everyone in its orbit. He sits today in a federal penitentiary in Virginia, serving life without the possibility of parole. He was transferred from the Supermax in Colorado in 2011. He has been behind bars for the better part of 3 decades, if you count all the sentences end to end. He is 66 years old. The courtroom in Brooklyn is quiet now. The Baisley Park houses are still standing. The neighborhood has changed, but the stories have not. In South Jamaica, people still tell them about the red jackets, the $200,000, the man who ran the projects like a Fortune 500 company and could not stop coming back to the one industry that would eventually bury him. When they convicted him in 2007, the U.S. attorney said McGriff would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. She said it like a conclusion, like the end of a chapter. But that is not how Queens remembers it. In Queens, the chapter never closed. It just moved to a different verse of a song that a kid from the neighborhood wrote before anyone knew his name. A song that named the players, described the rules, and accidentally started a war that outlasted every single person it touched. Supreme taps his chest. The marshals lead him out. And the courtroom, like the neighborhood, like the industry, like the country, is left to decide what exactly it just watched. A kingpin getting justice, or a system locking away its own reflection.